I'm a Professor of Law and Globalization. So today we are really thrilled to welcome back Professor Jeremy Keenan. Jeremy is a visiting professor with the law school and specifically with ISCI. Jeremy is a social anthropologist with an extraordinary breadth of knowledge and a research base in the Sahel and the Sahara. He's written many books and papers on the Sahel, and particularly of interest to those of us who work on state criminality, has looked at false flag terrorist operations in Algeria and Libya.
The whole of the Sahara,
region, the whole of the Sahara. And so he has a kind of, it's a very unusual expertise. It's a very, we don't often come across experts both on the Sahara, but specifically looking at state criminality in the Sahara. So we're delighted to welcome Jeremy back. And Jeremy, this is a report you can see here on the right that is available for everybody on the desk at the front. The report looks at Mali's genocide of the Tuareg people, and Jeremy is going to talk and speak largely to the report. This is the launch of the report, and we're very proud to have published it here at ISCI. So Jeremy, please, I'm not going to speak any further.
When this genocide was a year or two ago, it's had the most extraordinary ending, which you'd probably prefer to talk about rather than the genocide itself. And basically, the Tuareg have got their own back to bring the end of the story up, and the Russians have been absolutely slaughtered, not the right word for it, but they've had to withdraw in all sorts of ways. And the Malian government is on the brink of disintegrating. We don't know what's going to happen. But this genocide preceded it, and the two are sort of linked. When that wrote, I wrote the report. I should say and be honest that it could never have been written without the Tuareg on the ground, who were literally informing me day to day exactly what was going on. So the report is very gruesome. It's all the details, none of which I'll bother to go into because they're all much of a muchness. There's only so much you can do to mangle a human body. The Russians did it along with the Malian government. And so I was getting literally daily reports, well, not quite daily, but weekly. So emails through with technology, and these guys are very smart with technology. So I was able to draft this more or less as it was happening. What I've done in the report is academically given the background to it, which is very important, because genocides don't just happen like that. Well, maybe they're beginning to in this day and age. And also, one of the key things is proof. Proof legally is the most important thing, and one of the key proofs you need for a genocide is intent. And I'll come on to this, because the essence of this report, and the reason why I think it's so important, is that it gives and it documents the actual intent. So if and when they ever get to any sort of court of justice and so forth, which is highly debatable in this day and age, in this documentation, particularly with Ackley's work, and he can't be, he was in Libya today, there is intent by the truckload. What I was going to start off by saying is when we started this, I sent about 20-odd copies to people I knew, I won't mention any names, none of them are here, heads of international media organisations who I knew personally, and I said, look, this is important, at least give it a couple of inches, thinking that if you get a little bit of publicity, we might stop it or do something. I went to all the European councils, around all the institutions that deal with genocide, and there are quite a few. It wasn't that nobody did anything. There wasn't one single reply, absolute zero. And I won't embarrass certain people in the media who blab on about this sort of stuff all the time, never even replied, yet alone anything else. And I think, without being rude to any of you guys, the fact that we sent out 300 or 400 invitations people I spoke to, institutions saying it's important to come, if only to get the proof of what's going on. And the fact that so few of it is really what I want to talk about, and this is genocide. And it's become, people say that it's become an overused term. That's not the case. It's not overused. It is simply that with the increasing disdain with many of the world leaders have for international law and human rights, these crimes are now being committed with impunity. And I think that's the most important thing that I've got to say. I'm sure Penny would agree with me, and ISCI and this school. And I just listed them here. I won't go into detail but for recording, right now we've got Gaza. These are all recognised, or in the legal process of being recognised as genocides. Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, several in Sudan actually, because they're separate genocides against particular peoples. Anyone ever heard of the Masoli people? You would. Ewan knows every single people in Africa. The Masoli, as I've vaguely heard of them. I'm an anthropologist. I handled a court case for them in London a year or two. We won it, fortunately. And I didn't realise that they had been absolutely decimated in one of the many genocides in Darfur. And you can go around Darfur and you can count it tribe by tribe. But the Masoli was one. And Lebanon, of course, now is consistent with genocide and is being described as an extension of Gaza. Iran, that's the Iran regime, of course, they call it genocide under digital darkness. This is the killing of their own citizens. Over the last decade, of course, there's the Rohingya in Myanmar, started roughly 10 years ago, of which Penny and the school here were, I was going to say, highly responsible for, not for committing the genocide, but for doing the research on it, publishing it, and bringing it to life. The Uyghurs in China, the Yazidis, ethnic minorities in South Sudan, the newer, back into sort of ancient anthropological territory. Christians and other minorities in Nigeria. I don't like the use of the word Christian there because Trump's using it, but in fact there are all sorts of people getting killed there, it's not just Christians. Ethiopia, Tigray, going on to the present, Nagorno-Karabakh, and according to Genocide Watch, the situation in Sudan, Myanmar, DRC, Congo and the Gaza Strip are all currently classified as being in the active stages of genocide or genocide emergencies. So, and there are probably a few more. So when you come to a little place like this, which is a huge place actually, I mean that's almost the size of England, is that bit there, where very few people know the Sahel is a very unknown part of the world, the bottom of the Sahara, and the countries in it are probably some of the least known in the world, starting in Senegal. Could we have the Sahel map? That one, yeah. So the Sahel is really a climatic zone, an eco zone. Sahara and moving down here, so it's grassland, semi-desert. Senegal across Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, top of Nigeria, Chad, Sudan here. This is one of the most volatile zones in the world for many reasons, because it is multi-ethnic in one way. It's also the meeting point, not just of climates, but also of race. So you've got, as they call themselves, white-skinned people to the north, Arabs, Tuareg, Teda, and black-skinned peoples below. And the history of this area is the history of the interaction between these peoples, which historically was by and large very happy, and they got on extremely well, to put it in very simple terms. In the colonial period, things got a bit tougher. The French committed some of the biggest massacres ever been known. The Chano-Vallée mission, where they slaughtered everyone from Keys, which is about here. Everyone that they found was just killed. The French covered it up for years. It was discovered in about 1970 by an MA student, if I recall. So it's a very difficult zone ethnically, very complex. You know, for anthropologists, it's paradise. For a linguist like Ewan at the back, it's more than paradise. And when things go wrong there, they are disastrous. And they have been extremely happy for a long time. And so to talk more about the Tuareg specifically, just to give you a feel of them, I was going to say, if this report hadn't been documented, and that's really thanks to the two guys who are not here, I honestly think this would have never been known about. Mali denies it, everyone concerned just denies it. The Tuareg are called terrorists, and all these deaths, when they're just known as terrorist deaths, they're thrown in with Al-Qaeda and everyone else. And I think this report is literally the only proof of the existence of what happened here. It's that bad. Not a single newspaper report has touched it. Even newspapers and senior people, I'm appalled at it, just ignored it. They didn't even reply. They're embarrassed because you can't talk about genocide. There's so much of it. It's so much in the world. People don't even read it. So this report, I think, is probably the only sort of proof, if you like, of this, apart from the people themselves, and of course the survivors, such as Dante, wherever he is, and and the people like that whose families were killed. A key thing about genocide is to distinguish it from war crimes and crimes against humanity. I won't go into the elaborate details there. The key legal area of proof is this word intent. War crimes are horrific, crimes against humanity. Genocide does have this one key. And the definition of genocide, just to run through it, it's worth thinking about. It's the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, known as the Genocide Convention. It's an instrument of international law that codified for the first time the crime of genocide. And that convention was adopted by the General Assembly of the UN in 1948, came into force in 1951. And according to the convention, the Genocide Convention, genocide means any of the following acts with intent, and that's the key word, to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group as such. So it doesn't have to be thousands of people, it can be a small handful of people. The key to it is this word intent. The 5 areas defined in the convention are the killing of members of a group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, and it's worth just thinking of Gaza and places right now in these terms, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, in this situation in Mali, I refer to FAMA, F-A-M-A. FAMA is the Force Armée Malienne, the Malian Armed Forces. So the army calls itself FAMA, F-A-M-A. So FAMA, which palled up with Wagner, which I'll come on to, they've committed all of those first 3 in abundance, okay? But that is not necessarily enough for genocide. There has to be this intent, which I'll come on to. Ethnic cleansing, we hear a lot about, is similar to forced deportation or population transfer. So while ethnic cleansing and genocide, they may share the same goal, the same methods. In fact, they're almost one and the same thing, things like forced displacement that goes with it. Ethnic cleansing is intended to displace a persecuted population from a given territory. Genocide is intended to destroy that group. It's the intention to destroy which differs it from war crimes as such. And for the perpetrators of these acts to be guilty of genocide, there must be proof of intent. And this, of course, is one of the areas which in international law and in courts becomes very difficult. You could drop bombs by accident and sort of kill millions of people, but it may not be a genocide because the intent to kill them wasn't there. So in this case, you need to understand, and this report goes into this, the background to this situation there, because in that background there is documentary proof. And I only got it a few years ago by good luck, by accident, 400 emails from the Mali government, and it was all documented there, the absolute intent to kill these people. So just to introduce the Tuareg, they are the indigenous peoples of the Sahara. I won't go into the definition of indigenous because people quibble with it a bit, but they would regard themselves as that. Their geographical location is important. The whole of southern Libya, this part of Libya, Algeria here, this part here, coming into the Sahel, mostly the desert regions of Niger, the desert regions of Mali, and not much in Chad. So it's the desert areas, sort of just above the Sahel, but coming into the Sahel in those areas. Total population, we don't really know. There's never been, well, not for a very long time, any reliable censuses, and with people who are in trouble with governments, they tend to, censuses do dangerous things. Probably 3 to 4 million altogether. I wouldn't, if I stood up in court and said that, I don't think I could defend it for very long. So that's where we are. And let me just look at my notes here. Those are mine. We're dealing here with the people in Mali, which is here. Maybe if we could switch to the map of Mali. And that's great. And you'll notice Mali is a very strange shape. It's like a butterfly with a narrow neck here. And all this northern part is basically traditionally Tuareg country. And they call it Azawad. Azawad is the name for that part of Mali. And I should just go here. One needs to understand its history is so important, which I obviously haven't got time to go into, but vis-a-vis colonialism, it was all French territory. When the French were preparing to leave, because they knew when their time was up, all these French countries, the Tuareg were very worried. So were the French, because the French in 1957 discovered oil up in Algeria, and they suddenly realized that, whoopsie, we're handing over a gold mine or an oil mine, etc. So they tried to come up with a scheme where they could sort of divide Africa up and keep the messy parts, the Sahara, all this sort of stuff, where nobody wanted it, no one wanted to live, and we'll give all the rest of it to these people who are clamouring for independence. So they came up with a scheme called the OCRS, Organisation des Régions des Communes Sahariennes, the organisation of Saharan communes, regions of Saharan communes. And it was basically a map which you can draw a line, think where the oil is and anything good, below the Atlas, so cut out Morocco, all of Algeria where the oil is, Mauritania was thrown in for good measure, then a line that pretty well cut across on the old map where the Sahel is, it more or less cut across there, and it included Chad, and all that area was to be kept French, and all the rest would be given away. The idea lasted half a dozen years. I think it was closed 7 years later, and it was of course very appealing to the French right wing, the colonial interests of France, but it was squeezed out, and of course basically the Algerians put a stop to it in very short measure, and they just said forget it, we're taking the whole country like at Olympic. So the OCS sort of died almost as quickly as it was born, but the Tuareg were very aware of it, and I just find my notes again. The Tuareg were very aware, and they were petrified, well not petrified but horrified of the idea of all their lands which they had dominated. I won't emphasize slavery, but it was that sort of tributary relationship with the peoples to the south who were mostly black, and that they would be forming the new governments, so everything would be turned upside down. And the Tuareg were aware of this, and they managed it pretty well in most countries, in Algeria, surprisingly for strange reasons, but in Mali they were very worried by this, and they wrote the most extraordinary letter to de Gaulle, and Ackley has published the letter, it's not in my report, and it's an amazing letter in terms of saying to de Gaulle, look, we understand where you're coming from, we understand you've got problems, however, let us warn you, this will lead to all sorts of trouble You know, these peoples have never lived in harmony. You know, for heaven's sake, you know, do the right thing now. You know, make this and then give us this or do that. They warned de Gaulle of this. Of course, it was ignored. And with independence, within sort of literally 5 minutes of his starting, we had the first rebellion against the first president of Mali, a man called Modibo Keïta, who's interesting insofar he was trained in Russia. He was a Russophile. He was a so-called African socialist, but he was ruthless, and the Tuareg rebelled. I would say being rude about them, moaning about the usual things, marginalisation up in the desert, all this sort of stuff. And Modibo Keïta sorted them out using Russian jets. And this is the history of Tuareg rebellions, of which there are many. The one way to sort the Tuareg out, they're great fighters. They've got a history of being phenomenal fighters, and we'll realise that today because they're just sorting out the Russians. One way is to slaughter them. Not the men, just get the women and children, old people, commit literally genocides. And this is the history of the Tuareg, of massacre after massacre in all countries, not in Algeria, funnily enough, for other reasons. There's a lot of hatred there between the government and Tuareg, but that's been handled. But all through this area there have been histories of these sort of massacres, of literally using high technology to sort out nomadic communities. And the first of this was Keïta in 1962, just strafing, bombing nomadic camps from the air. All you're killing is the women, children, old people. And there's a long history of that right up to today, which we'll come on to. Where are we? Yeah. Further rebellions, always for the same reasons. 1990, 1995. And this is when we start hearing the Tuareg asking for autonomy. Not independence or autonomy. That was repressed brutally. Similar means again, just slaughter. And you can't get the fighters because they're too good at fighting, but you can get the women, the kids, the old people. And this is what happened again in the 1990s. Again in 2007. And that's a date worth remembering. I'll come back to it. Very, very important, because this is where we have all the written documentation of intent, which becomes so important. We then go on to the present, which is extremely complicated, and I'll try and tell the story of it. Starts in 2011, 2012, and you'll remember maybe those dates, the fall of Gaddafi, when the great Western powers went in to sort out the great dictator. I was on the Foreign Office Committee at the time. We met once a month. This was an advisory committee. I have never listened to such idiocy spoken in my life. And on one occasion, it had been going about 2 or 3 weeks, I sort of said, what happens if this goes on? I said for 7 months, which it was 7 months, that was just a guess. They were saying it'll be over in 2 weeks. And they said to me, Jeremy, what do you know about Libya? And that stuck in my mind repeatedly. I thought, I don't know, what the hell do you know about Libya? And of course it caused the ramifications have gone right through Africa. One of those ramifications was very specific, that there were many Tuareg in Libya. Many had lived there for many years. They'd gone up in lots of waves of migration. Some had actually gone up as mercenaries, been bought and paid to go and fight for Gaddafi. Very few of those. Mostly people who had fled the Sahel to avoid drought and famine down here. They'd gone to Libya. You could get work in the oil fields. You could work for Gaddafi, who'd bung him into a foreign legion, send you to Syria or Chad. You might get killed, you might not, but at least you learned how to fight. So a lot of the Tuareg who went to Libya did come back extremely able military people because of that work they did. And with the fall of Gaddafi, I keep pointing this map, they were thrown out by the revolutionaries. We don't quite know the numbers. Could be 2,000 or 3,000. It could be a few less. It's difficult, there's no real records of this, and people play around with numbers. But they returned, and Tunisia and Mali. The Niger government realised they had a real problem on their hands. A bunch of really tough fighters, you know, I mean, they're phenomenal fighters. Coming back, they were really cross with the world, cross with everybody for what had happened to them, the whole everything. A bit like this country blaming the world for the mess we're in, you know, we're angry with everybody. But they had lots of testosterone flowing in them, they had arms, ammunition and so forth. And the Niger government thought, you've got a problem here. So they sort of grabbed them all and said, we will integrate you, give you work into military units, sort of security services and all the rest of it. So in Niger, this problem didn't really come about. The Malian government didn't want to know, didn't give a hoot. So what happened was the Malian forces, these returnees, they joined up with the remaining rebels of this 2007 rebellion, which had trickled on and hadn't really been solved. And there was still a few, several dozen, maybe a few hundred fighters, very few, still left of that rebellion. They joined up and they formed right up in this very top corner, right up there on the far away as you can get from anywhere, a movement called the Movement National pour la Libération the movement for the liberation of Azawad. So they were decided, you know, the Mali government, which is down here, that's 1,000 kilometers. They didn't give a hoot for the north, they didn't like it, didn't like the people up there, weren't interested, so they decided they would go for independence. They would have wiped out the Malian army in 5 minutes, which they did, but Algeria, to the north, thought this is really worrying. This frightened Algeria because there's a big Tuareg population in Algeria, very fed up with the Algerian government, which is just as repressive as anywhere else, but we won't go into Algeria today. So the Algerian government were really frightened that this irredentist movement would spread into Algeria and heaven knows where else. So Algeria thought very quickly, we've got to stop this. They only had a couple of months warning. Gaddafi was killed September, October, these guys were back within a few weeks. So we're talking about November 2011. And the Algerian secret services, which are called the DRS, probably one of the most brutally efficient secret services in the world, extremely powerful. They ran Algeria completely. They also ran most of Mali, one should say, and the Kidal. They reckon they controlled the Sahel at that time. They decided the solution here was to create 3 more Islamist extremist groups, jihadists, whatever you want to call them, lock them up under the name of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which was a name that was given to a local group in 2007 by the Americans, because what was going on in Algeria from 2003 to 2010 was the global war on terror. But it was fabricated. There was no terrorists there. The whole business was fabricated. I've got a book on it, which it's here, I'll show you afterwards. So there was no terrorism in Algeria, but there was a whole war on terror against it. So there were all these groups, Islamist groups, infiltrated by the DRS. Their leading officers of the groups were DRS officers. And the key one you may have heard of, Iyad Agradi, who today is the #1 Islamist in the Sahel. He grew up in this lot, he was a DRS agent. He was given a group to run Ansar al-Din. Then there was Mujah, another group, and what was the other one? Ansar al-Din. Mujah, Ansar al-Din. Forgetting my own notes. Anyhow, 3 of these groups. And Algeria sort of literally pushed them into this top part of Mali, up here by Kidal, in the beginning of 2012, January. And they were armed by the Algerian army and provisioned and logistics and food and fuel, petrol, money and so forth. So these so-called Al-Qaeda terrorists flooded into Mali in quite considerable numbers, maybe 1,000 or 2,000, difficult to tell. They grew in number because they picked up a lot of discontent on the ground, and they took on their own agency after a while. But their job was to ally with the Tuareg rebels. So you get the Islamists forming an alliance with the rebels, because the senior, or the top of the Islamists, a guy called Iyad Agradi, is a Tuareg from the Kidal region. He knew them well. He said, we've come to give you support and so forth. So you had this very strange alliance, exactly as we have today, but it broke up in between. The idea for the Islamists, or the job, was to get rid of the Malian army, which didn't take much doing, the Tuareg did that, and then to wreak havoc and bring in the very worst of Sharia law you can imagine. Basically pushed by the Algerian authorities to get the world to understand that these jihadis were awful people, they just chopped off arms and legs and so forth, which they did under the direction of Algeria, but they were able to find some local people who went along with this, quite a few in fact, and they committed these awful atrocities through cities like Gao, Timbuktu, down to Mopti in 2012. And the whole idea was that the Tuareg would be demonized worldwide. They were blamed for this, okay? I can't go into more detail. I've just finished a book on it, 600 pages. It goes on and on and on. Anyhow, the micro details there. The Tuareg were blamed for these appalling acts. The fact that Iyad, the leader, was a Tuareg is neither here nor there. I should say there are lots of Tuareg and groups and divisions, but he was working for the DRS. Maybe still is today, but he certainly was then. By the end of 2012, they were threatening, they were down here, threatening to attack Bamako. Bearing in mind the Malian army had been more or less decimated by the Tuareg, and we don't know what might have happened, but Bamako thought it was going to fall. Today the population of Bamako, 4 million, maybe then it was 1 or 2. Anyhow, they rang out France. I should say that the UN had been bickering on about this for all through this time. Algeria trying to keep the UN out, because Algeria wanted this devastation to continue, to get rid of all these problems and a few others. France answered the phone, January, and overnight flew in military support, strength. Quite a big force, flown into Bamako, and within a couple of weeks, with high firepower and a lot of good modern army equipment, strafing from the air and so forth, they've driven the Islamists back. And the question is, where did they go? The French thought they had a great victory, and they were talking on about great victory, they defeated the Islamists. What happened, of course, is they just dissipated. Some went back to Algeria, where they'd come from, some went to Libya, some went to Niger, some melted away into the towns. How do you recognize an Islamist when you see them? Dante could be an Islamist, anyone, you and I could, Ewan could be, yeah. So they just melted away. And gradually, over a period of, from 2013, 12-13, up until, well, any time you like, it just got progressively worse in that the Islamists got stronger and stronger. The French made conditions worse by not understanding the local situation, appalling intelligence. You're dealing with the most impoverished people in the world, they've been made more impoverished. So this was ideal recruiting grounds for the jihadi groups who were recruiting mostly from little towns and villages all through this area, who were just trying to defend themselves from everyone under the sun. So a lot of these were local defense groups who were called up and joined into these very complex array of jihadist forces. I use the word jihadist very loosely, but other people call them terrorists. Some people can call them freedom fighters, but they're sort of in this jihadist world. The ideology was pretty weak. Wasn't much of it, because we're dealing with a very poverty-ridden, poor population, very soft Islam in that area of the world, and they just spread, and it became a horrific internal war. The second volume on my war on terror is called The War in the Sahel. When I started it, actually 8 years ago, I thought, well, I don't know how I'm going to, a couple of 100 pages. I got to 600 pages, I'm trying to stop it, cut it off, it's just going on and on. And it goes into this colossal war that's raged right through here for this time. I should say that while this is going on, up to 2020, the Tuareg, they've been stuck up here in Kidal. This is where they came in, this is their territory, when they were driven out by Gaddafi and they joined up. The French came in, and the French at least knew that there'd be trouble between Tuareg and call them blacks, no disrespect to them. So the French put a buffer in here. The Indians came in fairly quickly with 15,000 peacekeepers. Most of them were scattered around here. And the whole idea was to keep the Tuareg away from the Malian army, such as it was. And that stayed up until a short time ago, this genocide now. In 2020, you get a huge amount of unrest beginning, anti-French sentiment, driven heavily by Russian propaganda, particularly Yevgeny Prigozhin, who headed Wagner. He was a genius at propaganda. He ran some extraordinary things right through Africa, through Europe, which I won't go into details, but you've got to take your hat off to the guy. He was good on disinformation and propaganda. And he managed to whip up, through these extraordinary things, I've got a whole chapter on them in my book on the Sahel, this anti-French sentiment, which didn't take much whipping up because people were getting pretty fed up with the French, because from a military point of view, they were losing ground. The jihadists were gradually taking more and more, and the situation was, on the security front, was getting worse and worse. So you get to 2020, and there's a military coup by a man called Assimi Goïta, which is a good name for him, and he was in the Mali army. He had a second coup a year later, just to strengthen his power in the country. So it was a double coup, if you like. And straight after that, he then invited Wagner Group to come and help him. In the process, he told the French to leave. He told the United Nations to get out, so they were all chucked out of the country in 2002, 2003. Wagner came in. You have the same pattern happening in Niger and Burkina Faso a year or so later, not quite as violent as in Mali. And in August 2023, the last of the UN had left Mali. French had left at the end of 2022. So you've got no one left in Mali. You've got an army, which is a pretty ill-disciplined bunch of thugs, with Wagner troops who are even worse, a junta which is intent on one thing, and that is revenge against the Tuareg. The excuse is to restore national territory, bearing in mind that this part of the country had been technically outside of government control because the Tuareg were running it. So so the legal argument was to restore national territory. He waited till the last of the UN forces had left. It was August. You then get a slight hiatus for about a month, and the French, the UN were in bases a lot around in these areas up in the north, because this is where the friction was. And as the UN withdrew, Tuareg said, those are our bases. Mali said, no, they're ours. This is Mali national things. And Tuareg said, well, they were ours. We captured them 12 years ago, or 10 years ago. So you had about a month of bit of low-level fighting, skirmishing around a few towns, and during September, I won't go into details of them, no one really won, but both sides admitted they were at war. So the Tuareg said, we're at war, and Mali said, yeah, we're at war. So the word war was chucked around by both sides. We were dealing with attacks on old military posts, people killed, a handful here, a dozen there, that sort of stuff. October the 2nd, from Gao here, on October the 2nd, a military convoy, 90 odd vehicles, we're not sure how many troops, we can guess the number, 92 military vehicles, controlled by Wagner and Farmer, went north to retake this Tuareg area. Kidal is a town, maybe 50,000 people, and a region, there's probably a good 100,000 in there. Tuareg would say there are a lot more, but no one's really added them up properly. And that's about 300 kilometres. It's not a tarmac road, it's a pretty good dirt road. You could drive it in a day. You could certainly get an army column up there in 2 days. So they set off on October the 2nd. They arrived in Kidal on November the 14th. So you're thinking, what are you doing for 6 weeks, on a desert road? What they were doing was stopping by in little towns, hamlets in this area, local people, not necessarily all Tuareg or sort of mixed ethnicities, and butchering anything they could find, everything. So all human beings were just butchered, and I use the word butcher because it was worse than that. They could mutilate bodies in the most maximal way you can imagine. You know, slit up the stomach, let the entrails out, let them watch them fall. You name it, they did it. The few women that survived, they might rape them first and kill them after that, etc., etc. They would decapitate them and do two things with the heads. They'd stick them on poles by the roadside or trackside, or usually leave them on the chest of the body. So when people who'd fled the area came back to lift them, there'd be explosives under the head, so that would be blown up too. So they worked this one out, and they reckoned the only way they could get the bodies into graves was to get string around their feet and tow them into these graves. It was the most vicious, horrific, blood-curdling muck you can imagine. Everything possible was done, quite deliberately, because they took lots of photographs. And these photographs went all around. I was getting them over here. Horrendous stuff. So were the people in Kidal. And this was the purpose of it. This was Russian strategy. How you take a region, you terrorize it first, and you do this to the people down the road, and you send up photographs, say, this is what's coming to you. So a huge number of people just fled. We don't know the numbers. In the report I give some. They're all pretty low estimates, I think. I read a report a couple of days ago saying there was 300,000 in a refugee camp here. The UN runs it, they talk about 130,000, but a reporter says so. So you've got this problem with numbers, but we're dealing with tens of thousands. Of Kidal itself, at least 25,000 people left. Most of them who could, going up to Algeria, which was out of the frying pan to the fire, because Algeria didn't want them. They were appallingly badly treated there. Most tried to get across to Mauritania, at least where they were well treated. Some went up across and up to Libya, but most went there. And this column arrived in Kidal 6 weeks later. It's debatable whether it came under much fire on the way in or not. Tuareg will say, yeah, we gave a lot of, fighting. It wasn't much. I think that Tuareg, as far as they could, did a tactical retreat to some extent. It's difficult to know, it's too sad a story. But the point is, this town was taken on November the 14th. At this time, Wagner does not exist in Mali. It's officially denied by the government, it's never been there. They had committed some big massacres before this, one very famous one of 500 people and villages, one killed, all slaughtered, 4 days, the usual Russian, teaching people how to really, mangle up a human body. Horrific stuff. And that's all dealt with by the UN. That was way down south, down here, Mobdira. So the Russians came in with this appalling reputation. The Malian army, not much better, quite frankly. They've been doing this for a long time. And the genocide started on the 14th of November. And I've put that down in the report that day. Why can you be so specific? When you've done all this killing and murdering, appalling stuff, war crimes, call it what you like, how can you be so specific? Because both sides admit they were at war, but the aim of the war was to capture Kidal. They've done that. So it's over. We've restored national territory. So the war is over. So you've got these Russian and Malian troops up there. This is all desert territory, very mountainous, I should say, by the way. Most of these people are scared as if they've disappeared, but there's still a lot of people left in hamlets, little settlements, semi-nomadic life. And for the next, till July, I use the word duck shoot, which is a horrible term, it's American. These troops just went on a duck shoot, trying to find anything that was alive. Goats, camels, people, humans, kids, old people, anything they could find. Just kill it, slaughter it, burn it, rape it, slaughter it, burn any houses down, poison the wells, devastate the whole area, kill everything you have. We now know they had orders to do this from Goita, which is part of the intent, but I'll come on to that. And this went on, and I was getting these reports weekly from ISCI, who was doing a lot of work with Danta, and ISCI is, say, in Libya at the moment, and a couple of others with him. They've all been killed. I'll tell you about that. So I was desperately trying to get this report out, I was contacting all the international agencies. Not one replied, not one. I won't mention names until the beginning. It was just disgraceful. I couldn't believe the world had got to this state. And it wasn't as if I was a conspiracy theorist. People know my reputation in the region. If I say something happened, it's usually regarded as true. Then on July the 25th, well, it was a week before that, the troops left Kidal. They went up to about here, and they went on a duck shoot to come down close to the Algerian border. There are a few small settlements there, and we'll have some fun, see what you can kill off on the way and so forth. So they had a killing spree through little hamlets down through here, semi-nomadic peoples. And they got to a key area called, maybe if we could go to the bigger map of Mali. This is the same map, this is Mali Bay. So they went up to this place up here, and they came down through here, and they got to this place called Tinzaouatin, which, if you've got a copy of the report, you'll see that name's been blown up, and it's there. Tinzaouatin is a town on the border, and it's two Tinzaoutins. There's Tinzaouatin in Algeria, which is a bit bigger, and Tinzaouatin in Mali, which is smaller. And there's a dry river valley, a wedge that separates them, and that's the international border. And such as it is. And they came down here. We're not quite sure how big this column was. It was quite big, several hundreds. And their story is that somewhere about here, just outside Tinzaouatin, they got stuck in a sandstorm. You know, doesn't happen very often, okay? The visibility in the Sahara is often very bad because there's a lot of dust in the air. But sandstorms in big time are not quite so common. They happen. This was their story. Anyhow, they got ambushed and they got completely pulverized. And the Tuareg, who'd been keeping out of range, mostly up here, they knew this lot was coming down, and they destroyed virtually the whole lot. 84 Russians were killed. That's what Russia admits to. The farmer, we don't know, they would have died much more easily. Probably a few dozen, I don't know, farmer, they deny it. Anyhow, that sort of put a stop to everything. Russia, this was for Russia, which is trying to take over much of Africa, as you know, this was hugely humiliating. What the hell were they going to do, you know? And fortunately, the Tuareg took a few prisoners, who they looked after very well, because they don't kill dead men walking. They have a huge respect for these sort of things. So they had a couple of Russian prisoners and a few others who are still there, as far as I understand, still being well looked after too, so forth. Of course, they do not want to go back to Russia. They'd much rather be held prisoner by Tuareg up here. At least you get fed and chat and you're looked after, rather than going to Ukraine. So they all retreated. Then, about 2 months later, the Tuareg knew they would try and get revenge. Simi Goita back in Bamako ordered them to go up and get revenge. So up they came again, another huge military convoy. They get up as far as Kidal, and it doesn't say much for either Russian intelligence or farmer intelligence. This is quite mountainous country, and they reckon the main drag across to Tinzaouatin could be easily ambushed, which it could be. So they thought they'd go the long way around, this way. You know, just they got this super Russian tracked vehicles, they go through anything and so forth, except Saharan sand. And they got bogged down. There'd been some rain, so they either got stuck in the mud or in the sand. One way or another, they were just left paralytic, stuck. And all around them were Tuareg. And this scared the hen out of the Malian troops. They were spooked by the sound of Tuareg just watching them through the night. And no one was killed, not a shot fired as far as I understand. Anyhow, they lost it, and they were able to organise a retreat from about halfway up to Tinzaouatin back into Kidal. And they went back there, and the Tuareg was giving them good communications, saying, you know, next time you come up here, we won't be so nice to you, you'll never go away. They were, you know, threatening and warning them and so forth. That was in August, September, October, whenever that was, yeah, October. And so this great revenge on the Tuareg didn't happen. Then we get to December. By this time, there are Tuareg groups, not all of whom were terribly friendly with each other. There's a lot of divisions about it, but this time they'd all come together. And on December the 1st, they all met up here in Tinzatin. An agreement was to form a united Azawadi front. All Tuareg groups would come together, which they did, and they met at Tinzatin, or near Tinzatin, on December the 2nd. And they were all there, the leaders, all these groups had come together, probably for the first time in history. Maybe you get a united Tuareg grouping. And they all recognised this was it. While that meeting was taking place, the Malians, with a Turkish drone, put 3 rockets into the group that was meeting, and they were all killed. They were right on the Algerian border, and one of those rockets, the fire tracked across the border, actually went back there about 3 days later. I said, don't go near the place, you'll be killed. He went back there, he got all the measurements where the rockets fell and so forth. The guy's crazy, very brave. And we found the shells exploded in the Wed, in international territory. Anyhow, he was the only survivor out of that group. All the others, 8 leaders, the whole leadership was killed. That was in December 18 months ago, okay? Since then, there was a little bit of a, it's difficult to know exactly what happened. The Malian government, which was getting into more and more difficulties with the jihadists had left the area, they'd gone south, because they were frightened by drones. In the desert, you're a sitting duck. So they'd moved down into more forested area. So the Tuareg were up there on their own, more or less. And then, in April the 1st, Mali got itself 2 of these Vinci drones, long-range drones from Turkey. Turkey is incriminated in this, by the way, because they knew exactly what was going on. So they're party to it. So Algeria shot down an Vinci drone. And the other one had pranged because the Malis didn't know how to fly. So they had 2 and they lost them. This gave the Tuareg a huge breather. They could go right back up here and they were out of range. They regrouped and they rethought. They came to an agreement with the jihadists. We all want to get rid of the government. We may have other disagreements, which they do, but we have a common objective to get rid of the Russians and get rid of the government. And during that time, the Tuareg themselves got more handheld drones, and they were running around calling them, what's the word, munitions.
Hovering. Hovering munitions?
What, really?
Hovering?
Hovering, loitering munitions, which was the original technical term for a drone. And the Tuareg loved calling them loitering munitions, because they can handhold these things and load them up with a grenade or 2, go over a Russian, X million pound super machine, just drop a grenade in, boom, and they've done a lot of damage. This has scared the hell out of the Russians and the Malian army. So they've more or less been confined to barracks. They don't want to go out in the sticks because these loitering munitions might get them. So this went on until the 25th of April. During that time, you'll remember we had Iran intervene. And in February, this is sort of not irrelevant, on February the 8th, the Algerian leadership, along with the leadership of Mali and Libya, were summoned to go to Madrid and meet in the US residency in Madrid on a Sunday, where they were lectured to by Bush's and Trump's representative, a man called Boulos, and said this is what Trump is going to have in this part of the world. Firstly, we put a stop to this fight over Western Sahara. Here's the document. You'll meet in Washington in May and sign it. You can read it through now. That's how it will be. The Algerians agreed to this because America blackmailed Algeria and said you're going to be in trouble for using Russian military equipment, which they do all the time, and will designate the Polisario as a terrorist movement, which is hugely damaged for Algeria. So that was on February the 8th. They also said that Trump's message, he's going to take over all this part of the world because he wants the energy. That's Algeria, Nigeria and Libya. Because he can control that and he can hurt China, cut off China. China gets about 8% of its energy from Africa in total, most of which comes from Angola. So I don't quite know where Trump gets his figures from. But I had these from the intelligence services in Madrid and back, as straight from the horse's mouth. He also decided through, there's a paper I think Tom's printed off, which I was able to track back, for the last 6 months, planning that Trump would take over these Sahelian states. Not take them over, he would get rid of all these terrorists, had enough of these terrorists, and he was using some of the same people that Bush used in the intelligence sector to set up the artificial global war on terror 20 years earlier. People taken out of retirement, you're good on propaganda, come and, it's extraordinary. It's documented in that little paper I've written. And this was on February the 8th. Shortly after that, and Algeria would play a role in this. Their job was to prize Niger away from Mali, which they sort of did, restoring relations, etc., hasn't quite worked. And jointly they would get rid of somehow Goita, and get rid of these Russians there and nuisance, don't like them. And Trump would then rearm the armies, in quote, everything's on the table, military equipment and so forth. There's also gold minerals in these areas, which Trump probably had his eye on. And this was the American plan, which is documented in the paper, I think, Tom's lying around. Shortly after that, Trump got suckered into Iran, presumably by Netanyahu. Anyhow, he was off on his Iran adventure. So all this has been put on the back burner. Trump's plan for Africa, we presume. On the 25th of April, the jihadists and the Tuareg together launched a massive attack on every town in the country. I won't go back to that, but those big cities, the whole lot from dawn, coordinated, brilliant coordination, which had been planned between the jihadists and the Tuareg FLA, and that's it. That was 2 weeks ago. They put a car bomb in the house of the Minister of Defense, who was the key Russian liaison guy. I'm not sure of the death tolls. Everyone's a bit certain about that. The Tuareg fought for 2 days, the Russians who were based in Kidal, they were still there, and the Malian army, inflicted quite a few losses again. The Russians asked for a withdrawal. Whoops. The Russians asked for a peaceful withdrawal, which Algeria negotiated. So they withdrew. So the whole area, over 24 hours, suddenly is restored to the Tuareg. Russians are out, Malian army's out. Iyad, the head of the jihadists, in the meantime, has Bamako surrounded. 4 million people. All the food trucks are being shot at and burnt and blown up. So the latest news I'm getting is they're all starving hungry. The other cities, Gao, Mopti, Serre, so forth, are all under siege. Population starving because all the communications have been cut. And that's where we are. Russia clearly has no idea what's hit it. There's no clear indication what they're going to do, because if they pull out completely, they've lost Africa. Because this is the gem, if you like, of how Russia would reinstall itself in Africa. And that's literally today's news. So from this genocide, which went on for 8 months, and the slaughter was horrific. I haven't given details, I've got a picture there in the report. And if we could get to Ackley's book, can we go down to Ackley? I think he's on the next one. No, next one. Yeah, this is written by Ackley. If you've got a bob or two to spare, it's not yet out. I'm meant to be publishing it. I'm not quite sure where it's finished, because I've read it. It's horrific. He went back there under these extraordinary conditions, and he took testimonies from the survivors. And it's literally the evidence. My evidence, if you like, is more academic, is the history and these sort of things. He has got the statements from the survivors, what they did. It's you can't read it, you're in tears before you even turn over the page. It's awful. But it's the record, and it's going to be on Amazon. I'm not quite sure when, any day now, but it won't be any day. It could be a week or two, I'm not quite sure. He's up to his neck in Libya. But the book's finished, because I wrote the preface to it, so I know it's finished. but it's not yet out. This is horrific, and it gives all the details that I've sort of avoided and just alluded to. And the next thing is, what's going to happen to this part of Africa? And for me it's a nightmare, because I spent 20 years working there, 8 years writing these 2 volumes, and I've got to the end of the second volume, 1,000 pages altogether, and I haven't got a clue what to say. It's all up in the air. We do not know what's going to happen. Will Russia pull out? Will the Malian army pull itself together? I doubt it. Who will go in and help? No one in a hurry. Will Trump get involved? He's too busy trying to figure out Iran at the moment, so I can't see him running in a hurry to sort this out. If he does, he'll be in even bigger trouble. He'll be out of the frying pan into the fire. I can see an alliance coming together with political opposition movements, the jihadists, who are very soft jihadists, I should say, and they're already negotiating with members of the army who've had enough of the junta, political opposition groups, to form some sort of national grouping alliance, which theoretically would be under Sharia law, which means many things to many people. Much of traditional Malian society is not much different from soft Sharia. Okay, basically, it's to stop his troops going off and joining the Islamic State, who are further to the east. So he's talking about Sharia, but in Mali it will be a soft Sharia, not much different from the present system of Qadis and Marabouts who run the place now. And I can't really see any way out for Mali, other than for a regime to collapse, which is disintegrating somehow, for the population being starved to death, they're screaming and shouting, and for this sort of alliance to come together and maybe try and rebuild. Burkina Faso will go as quickly as it came. They're even worse than Mali. Niger is a soft touch. They will be sorted. So, you know, I started writing this 20 years of war in the Sahel, and it's got no further forward. But this genocide happened. It was real, it was defined, and they had, I didn't talk about the documents, when they had the rebellion in 2007, the Americans, who were trying to pretend there was a global war on terror, were telling the governments to whip up trouble. So that the 2 governments of Niger and Mali were provoking the Tuareg, literally going and raping women, killing awful stuff to provoke them to take up arms, which they did. And then they could say that these are all terrorists. Unfortunately, you had a big American embassy in Mali with a lot of staff in it, and some of those people, very clever American academics, historians, youngsters, and so forth. And thanks to, what's his name, WikiLeaks. Thanks to WikiLeaks, all the cables from the big embassy, American embassy, to Washington were all pinched by Julian Assange. So we had all these things, but no one looked at them for years. And when we got into them, there are 400, just over, from the staff in the embassy saying all this nonsense about the Tuareg terrorists is rubbish. They're appallingly badly treated by their government. The truth of the matter is the government has a policy. It's called Tuareg first, then Al-Qaeda. We'll kill the Tuareg, then we'll sort out your Al-Qaeda people later. And this policy is in writing, it's in print, it's in all these things, and this is the proof of genocide. That even back then, 10 years ago, they wanted to kill the Tuareg, get rid of them, then we can talk about terrorists and anything else, and so forth. These telegrams went to Washington, where they was put through a coding, a filtering system. Anything that made reference to what I've been talking about was filtered out. The only stuff that went up to the Pentagon, which was stuff that confirmed there was a border terrorism stuff, which wasn't very much because it wasn't there, a little bit of it. So all these telegrams from the staff in the American embassy, probably a lot of good people, anthropologists, historians, you name it, young graduates, sent to Washington, dustbin. Fortunately, we retrieved them, and they're all in my book, there's a whole chapter on them. So that is the key, one of the key lines of evidence. This was a slaughter with intent. They were intent on doing it before. They didn't get the opportunity because the UN peacekeepers acted as a buffer zone. The minute the UN were out, sent up there, and Goita's order was to kill all white-skinned people, i.e. Tuareg, in Kidal. And that's in writing too, because the Russian prisoners have all given video signed statements saying they were ordered to do this. And that's it. So that brings us up to today, and I don't know where we go from there, and I've spoken far too long.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think it's such an eye-opener for those of us who know so little about the Sahel and the Sahara, and it doesn't get the, I mean, we complain bitterly about the kind of news we hear from Gaza and Iran, but we get no news at all from the Sahel. So I think that you've opened up all our eyes today, so thank you so much. Are there any questions?
Hi.
Are we rather used to thinking, I mean, how did he do it? Because we're used to thinking of him...
Ewan, sorry, I'm deaf as a door.
Sorry, yes. How did Iyad do it? Because...
How did what?
Iyad,
Iyad.
How did he do it? Because we're used to thinking of him as a drunken liberty from 10 or 15 years back. So...
You talk about Iyad al-Rali?
Yes.
This is the chief jihadist. How did he do it? I've never met him personally, but I've had dealings with his people, his gatekeepers, and his family and his wife, and I know him like the back of my hand almost. He came on the scene in 1988, when he was one of these Tuareg who went up to Libya to avoid droughts and stuff. And on the way back, he stopped off in Tamanrasset in Algeria, and the Algerian secret services, who are very, very sharp, the DRS, and he thought, this is a smart guy. Talk to his... So, shortly after that, there was another Tuareg rebellion, and the DRS used Iyad really to let him know what was going on more than anything else at that time. And because Algeria always thought and thinks it controls Mali. It talks about Kidal as the 50th province, whatever it is, you know. And so Iyad he broke up with the Tuareg halfway through that rebellion, and he formed a peace treaty and the rest were not fighting. So he split with many of his Tuareg people and at that time. And he went through various funny things. He's a very clever operator. I won't embellish him too much because he's wanted for war crimes and God knows what else. But the DRS looked after him. They provided him with a sanctuary in Algeria. So one reason why the French couldn't really militarily beat the jihadists, whenever the French sort of chased them, they flipped across the border into Algeria, literally, you know, on that map just across there, where they were given sanctuary by the Algerian regime. So Iyad had a house there, he had his wife there, and the Algerian army spread across that border. They were protected, and they still are. And a lot of, if you hear the stories of refugees or hostages that were taken hostage in that part of the world, and they're all together, about 70 altogether overall, I can't remember the exact number. Those that were released, I've managed to find out that most of them were held in Algeria under the protection of the Algerian army. So the terrorists, the victims had no idea where they were, but they were in Algeria. And this came to light with two French journalists who on that map were on that border, minding their own business, looking at something else. They were there one day when there was an exchange of hostages with who was the previous French president before Macron?
Sarkozy, yeah. Is it Sarkozy?
Sarkozy, I think it was Sarkozy.
No, not so. Gosh, this is old age for you. Anyhow, the president before Macron. He was there doing a transfer of French hostages. There were 9 that had been taken allegedly by so-called Al-Qaeda, but to protect them so they weren't killed by accident, probably, they were sheltered in Algeria. I had very strong information on this. I couldn't prove it, but I sort of sensed it, knew it. These two French journalists, a man and a woman, aged about 50, were up there doing something completely different. Little village called Boukhessa, you know Boukhessa? Professor, yeah. They were there, and they saw this stuff going across the border, whatever it was. They say to some local Tuareg, what's going on? And they say, oh, that's the French hostages being brought back. From where? Algeria. Okay. 3 weeks later, both of those journalists were assassinated. The case is still live and it's open. That was 2016, 17. So you have IAD, who is the chief...
By the Algerians?
Yeah, well, everybody wants that kept under wraps, certainly the Algerians. We don't know. It was a nasty assassination. They were just gunned down outside of Kidal. But they knew too much. Fortunately, I had managed to pick up their telegrams where it was at the time, so I knew what they'd seen, and I knew they were there anyhow. So you have this support being given by Algeria to IAD, who's the chief jihadist. This is why when the Mali government goes on about Algeria supporting international terrorism, it's actually half true. Okay, so the Mali government may be awful, but they've got it right when it comes to Algeria. And this is why the French military could never get on top of things, because they would just flip across the border, they would get medical supplies there, IAD would go up to Algiers, go to hospital, have a chat with the regime, all sorts of things. And I was gradually getting this through sources in Algeria, and you put it together slowly a little. So and how he's got stronger recently is basically that Mali is in such a mess. There's a very interesting statistic from ACLID, who are the people who measure all this stuff, that since, I've forgotten now, since 2020 something, 50,000 people have been killed in this area. The majority, and ACLID records every death it can find, they're an international monitoring organisation, the majority have been killed by the armies of the three countries. So they're the biggest terrorists. The second number of killings is by Wagner. The third number of killings is by the jihadists. Okay? And they don't need to kill anymore. They take over regions, protect them from the army or the Russians, whatever they can hand, try and get some sort of stability into them, look after them, and etc., etc. And in a sense, they've pacified, if that's the right word, quite a lot of the countryside. Okay? And also done some recruiting and some nasty things. After the 25th, about 3 days ago, they went down to Bandigara country, maybe a day or two before that, and the Dogon, were a tribe whom you all know well, have always provided militia support to this wretched army. So a lot of the killings were done by Dogon hunters called Dozo and so forth. So IAD thought, now we've got control, we'll just teach them a lesson. They went down there. They say they slaughtered 70, I'm sure it's many more than that, in the Bandigara area. That's right down at the bottom of Mali. So you're getting this sort of revenge stuff coming up. IAD's view on that, I'm sure, would be they slaughtered hundreds, thousands, working for the army, you know, teach them a lesson. I don't know what he would think, but that's what happened this week. So it's messy, but he's got most of Bamako under siege, 4 million people getting short of food, fuel trucks are being bombed and blown up as they come in. The Russians managed to escort one load of tankers in, but there's only 2,000 Russians there. You can't have all of them escorting tankers up from Guinea or Senegal, where they've come from, while you're trying to control 1,000 kilometres of the rest of the country. It's more than that. It's a huge country, Mali. It's huge. So IAD, the question is how will this relationship work out between IAD and the FLA? They have one thing in common. They both want the Russians out, they want the regime out. Beyond that, they spend the whole time arguing and bickering. Even though IAD is a Tuareg, for which he's not forgiven by many of his people, he's often seen as a traitor, all sorts of things, the divisions there. So how this alliance between Jenim, the jihadists, and the FLA will pan out, I don't know. I suspect, because they both had such a hammering, they'll probably get on okay for a while. I don't know what you may think about that. And it depends, of course, on what sort of retaliation might come from the Malian army, which is not in a position to retaliate, I wouldn't have thought. Niger and Burkina Faso said they've come and helped, but they're not up to much. Russia has got its own problems, and it's also frightened of troops moving around in the area because of these loitering munitions, which ACLID reported 65 attacks in the last 18 months. 65 attacks on government Russian forces, I'm sure they're more than that, but that's what they've recorded. So it's quite a dangerous entity. If you're in a military vehicle, no matter how super it is, you've got a Tuareg behind a bush, you know, with one of these things just loitering over your head and a grenade going down the manhole, you know, you're not going to go out in the bush, no matter what armaments you've got. So it's difficult to tell. Everyone's exaggerating. The Tuareg think they've conquered the world, which in their eyes they probably have. The Malian government's trying to pretend nothing much happened. It certainly has. It's very little news is coming out. As you can see from the media attendance here, every single one's been notified in Europe to come and have a report. Not one here. They couldn't give a stuff, okay? As long as they got the Labour Party to write about, or Trump to write about, or whatever else, they're busy. And the editors don't care. I mean, you know, I won't say more about media. But we went to a lot of trouble to send 300-400 emails, at least, to almost everyone, personalised, to key reporters. You know, not even, you know, end of story. That's the situation we're in. So there's complete impunity for anyone who wants to do anything here. So anyone who wants...
I'm just going to try and see if there are any questions from
sorry, yeah.
We've got one in the room, two in the room, and are there any online, Tom?
No.
Okay, so let's start with Angela and then we'll come to...
Yes, so I want to thank you again for this.
I'm going to come near.
Oh, sorry. My voice is also not. So
It's all right.
I want to thank you for such an incredibly rich and detailed historical and anthropological discussion of these dynamics. My question is really quite a simple one. With all these different perpetrators of violence, and also with this victim population that you mentioned has been completely invisibilized, what do struggles for justice look like in this kind of context?
What do what?
Struggles for justice for victims look like in this context, especially when you have someone like yourself who's been trying to document all this violence?
I think zilch. I don't know, Penny might disagree because she's sort of on top of the world in this thing. But all I know is that Mali has withdrawn from the ICC. How are you going to prosecute Russia? They've got so many war crimes up against them. This is just another one. And the ICC couldn't handle it. The ICC had a case against this back in 2017. I was a key witness to it. That's still sitting on ice. That was another massacre, which IAD was involved in, by the way.
Was that the ICC or the ICJ? Was it
In
against the
Hague,
state?
International Criminal Court.
So it was against individuals? So it would have been against individuals?
Yeah, it was against IAD. Yeah. So you've got this. I've given up bothering, to be quite honest. I just want to make sure it's documented now. So I've got half a dozen books, which are all nearly finished now, so at least it's documented. I've written to UN agencies and so forth. So often, no reply, nothing. You can't go on forever. And in a sense, there are some good international just human rights groups, these organisations. They're there and they'll move in as quickly as they can, and they will bring action. And with a bit of luck, my work might be used as evidence there, with the key evidence coming from people like Ackley, who's on the ground. I'm just documenting what he's been sending through to me, in a sense. So yes, there is hope. Human rights groups will get back in there at some point, but it's going to be a hard time. You've got, allegedly 10,000 of IAD's jihadists. He's up before the ICC, which is guilty of another crime. They'll go after him for sure. How they'll get him, I have no idea. Mali's withdrawn from the ICC. but it's got a few months to go. It's there. I've had no reply from the ICC over the evidence that I gave, which was the main evidence in a case against him, and that was 2017, I think. So I don't know what they're up to.
Did you have another kind of understanding of justice, Angela, rather than the formal international courts?
Yes, I mean, I suppose I was thinking about when you speak to victims on the ground, how they are also maybe thinking about, not even just justice, but resisting this kind of violence. I was also thinking about, you know, the kind of private military security companies that, you know, like Wagner, you know, they're such important players in this kind of violence, but are there other ways outside of kind of the criminal justice system that we might be able to confront and disrupt that kind of power?
Yeah, the only private militias running around there at the moment that I know of are the Russians, and they are part of the problem. They just, I mean, their view is that the villagers here saw a battle, the villagers must be guilty, but slaughter them. And, you know, they brought back in cannibalism, all sorts of stuff has come in, and it's grotesque. So private armies are there. You've got this sort of lunatic scenario of Trump's. I call it lunatic, but I've got all the documentation for it, and you read it through and you think, what the hell's this guy? You know, and it's he's been led up the nose by a guy called Boulos, whose son has married Tiffany, his other daughter. If you go. So I can't see, and Trump has said, we're not interested in human rights, we're not interested in any of this sort of nonsense, we just want the army to get rid of all these terrorists. In Mali, everybody's a terrorist. They're all terrorists. You know, it's such a stupid word. And you've got such a complex, ethnicity on the ground. I mean, you at the back here knows more about it than I do. I mean, how many linguistic groups across Sahel? 800?
Gosh, I couldn't hazard a guess, but it does go to this question of collective memory, which I think is terribly important. Circassian Genocide Day was commemorated in London on the 13th of May, and it refers to a genocide between Russian genocide between 1863 and 1867, and it's still an active shaper of Circassian Turks' way of thinking. Palestine, of course, is another example. In some ways, these long-term dynamics seem to me more important politically, ultimately, than conviction in the ICC.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important. I mean, I look at it slightly from a Malian perspective, because when I look at those cities along the Niger, Gao, Timbuktu, above all Kurikuru, these are the places where the Malian Empire, the Mandinka Empire, began. So I would kind of ask questions of Danto, who's, you know, informed me a lot about this.
A very good thing, you know, I've been sounding terribly negative. There is an optimism to Mali, and that's its people.
Yeah.
You've got a country which has got along, in a manner of speaking, for many years, multiple ethnicities, races, you name it. And when I first started hanging around in that neck of the woods, this was being put out by the Americans as the perfect example of a democratic country where everyone got on with everyone else. In a sense, it was almost true, because the way the regime managed things was quite crude in a sense. Most of it was into smuggling or crime or, you know, trafficking of gold or drugs or something. And the president would just make sure this was, divvied out between each tribal group and the leader, and they came down and you had it. And there was a case of 10 tons of coke which came down in a plane, you may remember it. And they all started fighting over that. And the president went up there. The president went up and said, you know, he wasn't bothered by the coke. He said, this is your coke and this is your coke. And he divided the stuff up and then it went off. So you had this division which was recognised by all this multiplicity of ethnic groups. And the governments would sort of participate in that. And this is why within Mali there is a fantastic sort of belief in democracy. There is this residual belief. And so that's the optimistic side of it. And there are also people who I think will come in with Iad, sort of old, very iconic preachers, a man called Imam Mahmoud Dika, Diko rather, who's up in Algeria. And there are 2 or 3 of these well-known preachers who will preach peace and reconciliation and so forth. They're very powerful. They've got a, so the good news is that that sort of combination of people, the old school politicians who think democracy is wonderful because they had a wonderful time, they always got divvy up, you know, with drugs or whatever it was going through the country, and these very sort of Sufi preachers who are soft line and stuff, who will talk to Iyad, and he will talk to them. So in a sense, the possibilities for reconciliation, based on this great historicity which Ewan's talking about, is there. And if you get people like Trump, keep them out of the way, and get the Russians out of the way, and you know all the rest of it, and let these people go back. They will find a way. Sorry.
Dante, now your question. Sorry, you've waited very patiently.
You will translate from, because
Sure.
you speak very good Arabic, so the question is just to explain a little bit. From a channel of Azawad News called Islam 24. سؤال لا نحتاج نسأل بروفيسور جيرمي كينان.
We need to ask Professor Jeremy Keenan.
سؤال موجه.
We need to ask Professor Jeremy Keenan. Sorry.
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
This is from the channel, yes.
ما هو في رأيك أنت كخبير في الساحل؟
What is your opinion as an expert on the Sahel?
في مستقبل الأزوار في المشاكل القائمة اليوم. شكرا.
About this, what is your opinion of the future of Azawads amidst the current problems?
Okay. I'm going to give you a long-winded answer.
In 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes.
So that we can...
This Tuareg problem is typical of all these countries in which there are Tuareg populations. Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, all of them. Mali is worse because of this. And I've been talking to these people on and off for 60-odd years. And I was preparing a book, which will now never get written, called Return to Agadez. Agadez being a town up in Niger and so forth, where there's a Tuareg governor who's a lovely guy and stuff. And conversations with people like that and other people, I won't call them dignitaries, people who know their own people and so forth. The message I've had from them is there's only one solution to the whole of this Sahara problem. Let the people who know the Sahara run the Sahara, because everybody else has stuffed it up. No one can run it. You have to be a Saharan person to understand how it works. And this is absolutely true from the biology, even if you're taking oil in and so forth. Fortunately, there's not much in the way of oil rights in these areas. So this idea of having, and this very nearly came to life in 2001. There was a movement. Before 2001, there was a big rebellion in Algeria, a civil war. The whole of the Sahara was closed down to the outside world. You couldn't go into Algeria. Mauritania was tied up with Western Sahara. Tuareg rebellions in Niger, Tuareg rebellions in Mali. Gaddafi, trouble in Libya. You could not get into the Central Sahara. It was completely closed down. I know this because I was the first European back in there. And I got a huge book contract on it. Blew every penny of it before I got there. and it was back there. And at that time, unfortunately, a lot of the Tuareg remembered me and we were talking. And they decided, we've been silenced from the world for 8 years. We had no access to the internet. Now suddenly, we're in a new era, new communications, we can control the world. And they had about 30 people, old chiefs, headmen, respected people, you name it, people who knew what they were talking about, from all these Tuareg groups, to come together to form. They had names for it, but it was going to be very green, because they were sick of the Sahara being trashed by tourists, you know, archaeology snaffled and cave paintings damaged and trees chopped down for wood and all this sort of stuff. So it was a very green organisation. They had talks, and I was Fortunately, I was with them purely by accident for 4 years when these discussions were going on. And they all fell apart because America decided to have a war on terror there. So that put a stop overnight to all this because they fabricated terrorism. But they had succeeded amongst themselves of talking, and they had cell phones by this time, communicating, but every country in the area was determined to block them. They were not allowed to leave their own countries. They blocked them going from Algeria to Mali, which was open border. So the countries in the area who were aware of this at some level or another just stopped this happening. They wouldn't allow any meeting. So the countries were all frightened of this happening, but the people wanted to get together. That was 20 odd years ago. Talking to these guys up to a couple of years ago, the only people who can run the Sahara are the Sahara. I still personally believe that for quite different reasons, the OCRS had something going for it. Then it was a colonial entity, it was so France could control the minerals. But I really do believe that through the UN and so forth, the peoples of the Sahara, through the indigenous working groups and so forth, could have some sort of association, God knows how it would happen in international law, that would enable these people to have some degree of autonomy over these contiguous areas where they all Tuareg, they all have to share a language, mentality, a culture, an understanding of the world, an understanding of victimization, an understanding of how the Sahara actually works, how you can live in it, how you can do things in it, how you trade in it. When they put sanctions on Niger some years ago, I said to a friend there, can you get stuff? She said, oh, anything. Frozen yogurts from Switzerland, down tomorrow morning. Okay, smuggling is how the Sahara works. Everything goes through it, over it, under it, by it, and everybody wants money. Left to the people who run it, which are the Saharas, the people, yeah, mostly Tuareg, but not exclusively so. They all recognise each other's ethnicities. Many of the Arab tribes of the Sahara in amongst them. If somehow these wretched states, which are only figments of the colonial imagination, with ludicrous boundaries drawn in ridiculous places, cutting across all sorts of best interests and so forth, if that could somehow be removed and allow those people to work together, and they're aware of this, they tried it in those 4 years. I called it the Prague Spring, and I've written about it, and it was almost there. You know, we were meeting there, everyone. I was the lowest level of person in terms of communication skills. I'm digitally dyslexic, but they were all there on cell phones, they were all fixing up meetings, you know, in bottom of Libya and these places. And then suddenly, overnight, 32 European tourists got kidnapped by Al-Qaeda.
2005.
2005?
3.
They tried it in 2002, messed it up. This was the Americans working with the Algerian DRS to fabricate terrorism, to create the war on terror. All it did was destroy the indigenous well-beings of half of North Africa, because it's still going on. And I've got a copy of the book here. Can you bring it up on the screen, Penny?
Yes.
And it is absolutely terrifying.
Which one?
It's the books.
Oh, sorry, the other one.
Sorry, Penny. That one, the one on that one on the left. That's now published, and that takes you from 2001 to where we started date 2011. It's in 2 volumes, and this is the fabrication of terrorism, and it's a horrific story. It's almost unbelievable. For years, I was called a conspiracy theory because you could not believe this was going on. How do you do it? It happened. Fortunately, everything's documented and so forth, and the proof has come out. You know, the final levels of proof were nicking all Hillary Clinton's emails when she was Secretary of State. There was a whole load of muck in her private emails which said, how can this be going on? Because I know he works for the army, so all this, she gave away all the identities of, you know, spies and this sort of stuff, without knowing it, of course. So all the evidence was coming together of what the Americans had done. It destroyed the livelihoods of almost every person in the Sahara from top to bottom. All the tourism stopped. Tourism is a good thing and a bad thing, but vast numbers of people lived off it. They rented camels out to them on camel treks. They took them here, they showed them the cave paintings. You know, it's one of the hot spots for tourism in the world, the Sahara. It's a magnificent place. And if it's well managed, and the local people certainly were managing it extremely well, because they had these associations, organisations, and Algeria, in spite of being a pretty criminal bunch, have always tried to manage this actually quite well in terms of conservation and preservation. You know, I won't abuse them on everything. They've done quite a good job there. And this was moving. We're talking about, I don't know, millions of households, people who lived off an economy which literally in an action that took place it took place over 2 or 3 weeks actually, but the kidnapping of 32 tourists, then claiming it was Al-Qaeda, then naming the terrorists and where they were, they were in Niger and Libya and all this sort of stuff. The whole of the Sahara was closed down, as it had been a generation before under the Libyan stuff. So everyone's livelihoods were destroyed. But the people there, they would say, if this ever comes to an end, this is how we will recreate the world. And I was with them. I was the first European to be allowed back in there, for rather dodgy reasons, I should say. But I was able to talk to them and listen to them and record, this is how it will be when the world comes back together again. We can bypass all the governments because we've got cell phones. We can hedgehog them. We can talk to European tourist agencies in London, Frankfurt, Berlin, and arrange things. We haven't got to go through the Ministry of Bribery and Corruption in the middle, etc., etc. They had all this planned down. It was extraordinary. And I saw it, I wrote about it. And I was the only European who was there when it happened. And that's the end of the story. It happened. For 4 years, I called it the Prague Spring. And they were planning this. They were planning how they would reintegrate the Sahara, get rid of all these wretched governments, which are plunderers, which they are, and abusers, which they are. And how one forms a new constellation of that. And this is what, up to a year or two ago, before a key person was kidnapped, so it's kind of difficult to get back into it now. So the old governor in Agadez, you know, and a few others like that, they were saying, this is the only way this part of the world can run. You've got to let the people who've lived here and managed it for hundreds of years, thousands of years, we know it, we understand it, we understand the neighbours, we understand the history, we understand the racism, we understand this, we understand the hatreds, we understand all the old feuds, you know, we know where we come from. And they're watching what's happening. They're watching and seeing the destruction of a whole world. And, I mean, this book I won't write was Return to Agadez. I think I'll be dead soon, I'm sure of that. But it was just to somehow, you know, I've lived through this era. I've lived through from the 1960s when I was first there. Okay, I was still in the colonial era, but I saw the original traditional life, what was left of it. Quite a lot of it was, you know, through this trauma after trauma after trauma. And this present lot here, it's just, for the Saharan people, this is just another genocide. There have been lots more like this. This is the one we managed to document. And that's important to get it there. Names of the people whose heads were put on poles. Thanks to Ackley and the other guys who got killed when that rocket hit them, all the names are there. So whenever some sort of justice people, human rights groups get in there, the documentation will be there. It may come through this place. You know, this has got a reputation for, this is ISCI and the School of Law here for working on these sort of things. Something may be brought together. But there is this huge optimism that even Iyad, the head terrorist, I have a lot of time for him, because I've known him since '88 when he was a nasty little kiddie, being a nuisance. He's clever, he's smart, he understands all this. He's building whatever he thinks he's building for himself. He will be accepted, I think, by these people, these Imam Diko and these sort of people, and some of these religious leaders, certainly some of the politicians. He is fairly moderate. You know, he's been beaten up a few times, he's getting on a bit, I think, and he's not a crazy, you know, extremist, Islamist. He was on a whiskey bottle for years, you know. I'm sure he'd go back to it quite quickly if life turned around. And, you know, these are optimistic things. And also, when you've had so much slaughter, and we're talking about 50-odd thousand people in the last few years here, village after village, just corpses everywhere, you know, and people sort of live with death. And they acclimatise to it in a way. They can manage it, they can see a future. You know, new kids are born, you know, they can create. And human beings are phenomena like that. Particularly if you get rid of these tyrants, these regimes that come from all over the place, whether it be colonialists, the Russians or Trump, whoever it is, if they're kept out and you just left these areas. And this is what the people themselves are talking about. Some sort of OCRS, the French had for completely wrong reasons, but that sort of structure which could be accepted by the countries around it, God knows where you put sovereignty and all the rest of it, but some degree of autonomy, I don't know. Somewhere in that mix there is a future.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's the first time I've heard of alcoholism as something optimistic, but that's interesting. But thank you very much for a fascinating engagement with a part of the world that we all need to learn much more about. I mean, there are very, very few people who could do what you've done. Thank you very much for your contribution to exposing this genocide.
Thank
It's
you, and
hugely important.
thank ISCI for printing this. You know, we couldn't do anything of this actually without Penny and Tom. You know, it's not just me. There are other parts of the world they deal with. I mean, this place is actually will become in history one of the few centres that sort of stood up for whatever you call it, justice or something.
Absolutely.
You know, so.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And we're now going to listen to some more beautiful music, I hope, whilst have a drink, a little snack.
Yeah, so
And-
yeah, why not? Yes.
Yeah. And